Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is one of the most popular ways we measure our indoor environment these days, particularly when we're trying to understand things like ventilation performance or our risk to infection in indoor spaces. And there are countless discussions on what we consider good and bad levels of this to be, whether it should be 800 this or 1000 that, what action we should take at what points, and what impacts potentially it has on our health and well-being or performance even. But what we rarely consider in these conversations is the actual accuracy of these devices in a field environment, and in fact the accuracy of the device itself. I'm picking on CO2 particularly here because it's one of the most commonly understood metrics at the moment and one of the most widely deployed sensors out there. Here we can see a very typical display of some of that CO2 data coming from a low-cost device. In this case, it's an AirThings device. I'll show another one in a minute, but they're all broadly the same. They show a time series graph, a ziggy-zaggy line of CO2 rising and falling during several days of the week. And in this point here, I've highlighted one point that's showing 987 parts per million. Here's another screen from another device, in this case an Imbiot device. And here we can see again CO2 rising and falling in an office space throughout the week. And here I've highlighted a point in the graph that shows 595 parts per million. And to be clear, these are all market-leading devices showing CO2 in a time series format, and you would be making decisions or thinking about the performance of that space from the data that they're providing. So here's the challenge, I think. When we see these numbers presented to us, we very rarely think about whether what we're seeing is actually truly representative of what's happening in that space. This particular graph here is taken from one of those sensors and just presented on a spreadsheet graph. But you'd be looking at this information thinking at certain points, I'm seeing 1,000 parts per million or 1,200 parts per million. But is that actually true? You see, all sensors have a range of accuracy, and often it's described as a plus or minus value in this case parts per million. So CO2 devices would often have a CO2 range of plus or minus 40 or 50 parts per million. And then at certain levels, they'll also have an accuracy range in a percentage term. So they might be accurate within 4 or 5% plus or minus of the value as well. And the impact here is the higher the number, the bigger impact that plus or minus percentage has. So if we take the data from this graph and overlay the plus or minus accuracy of that device, we get a very different picture. Here's that same graph, the green line showing CO2 rising and falling typically around the 800 parts per million level and spiking up to as high as 12 or 1300 parts per million at one point during the day. But now the red and blue line represent the upper and lower bounds of the accuracy of that device. And we don't mentally think that way when we're looking at these graphs, not to mention the location of that sensor and the field accuracy. We'll come on to that in another video. But here you can see that what we thought was quite a precise number, in fact, can have quite a big band to it. So when we're getting our knickers in a twist over whether we think something should be 8 or 9 or 1,000 parts per million, we do need to consider how we measure that value and really what the true value of that number is. This is about managing risk in spaces, and we shouldn't get too caught up in the precise number that we're using to define that. Perhaps if these graphs represented their value in a way that truly represented their accuracy, it might make people rethink a little bit about what they're actually seeing. So what if graphs, instead of being a thin, precise line that gives this perception of accuracy, that actually there was a thickness in that line that was representative of the true accuracy of that device? I wonder if that would change our perception of the data that we were looking at here. So if we were looking at a graph like this, for example, that truly represented the accuracy of a sensor, maybe it would change our framing of what we were describing as a risk in that space. What do you think? If you're interested in CO2 more broadly, there's a video here you might like to watch.